It fits seamlessly into your daily routine, whether you're eating, studying, driving, hitting the gym, or just killing time. If you want to think deeper, question more, and actually understand the world, subscribe to the History Trending podcast.
Imagine holding a stone that, actually proves the existence of a ghost.
Right. Yeah, it's a wild thought.
Because for centuries, literally centuries, historians thought Pontius Pilate was just a myth.
Completely fabricated, yeah.
Think about that. He was one of the most powerful men in the Eastern Roman Empire, right? A prefect. He commanded thousands of troops, he collected massive amounts of taxes, and he governed this highly volatile province.
Very volatile.
And yet for nearly 2 millennia, the earth just swallowed him whole. We had zero physical evidence he ever existed outside of, some ancient texts.
Not at all.
So if history can completely erase the physical footprint of a powerful Roman governor, how do we track down a penniless itinerant preacher from a backwater village who never wrote a single word?
Yeah, it's really the ultimate forensic cold case. We are so used to modern standards of proof today.
Oh, totally. Video footage, birth certificates.
Exactly. Clean DNA swabs, digitized tax records. But when you step into the world of ancient history, that entire laboratory just shatters.
It's gone.
Right. You're left standing in this murky landscape of fragmented manuscripts, copies of copies, and stones that had been worn smooth by 2,000 years of wind and war.
Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we are taking you, the listener, on a really intense forensic investigation into antiquity. We are doing a deep dive into an incredible stack of sources.
A very heavy stack today.
Oh, yeah. We've got historical essays from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, entries from the Jewish Encyclopedia, symposium transcripts from PBS Frontline.
We're looking at deep linguistic analyses from New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman's academic blog, too.
Right, and historical breakdowns from channels like Let's Talk Religion and Catholic Productions. It's a lot. And as we dig through this, I need to make something perfectly clear right at the top. We are playing the role of neutral historical detectives today.
Strictly neutral.
We aren't taking sides. Whether you view the subject of today's deep dive as the divine Son of God, a subversive political philosopher, or just, a first-century troublemaker, our focus is strictly on the academic methodology. We are looking at how historians actually determine the reliability of ancient texts, and how they apply those methods to answer one of the biggest questions in human history: the historical existence of Jesus of Nazareth.
And that neutrality is, it's absolutely critical to the methodology.
Right.
Because if you approach ancient texts with a purely theological agenda, either to prove a religion is completely true or to prove it is entirely false, you are going to misread the history.
You bring your own baggage into it.
Yeah. The historian's toolkit is designed to filter out that noise.
Yeah.
We aren't here to debate the supernatural. We are here to look at the parchment, the linguistics, the archaeology, and, well, the historical consensus.
Because there's a massive paradox right at the center of this whole thing, isn't there? We are talking about a poor man from an occupied Roman territory. He never commanded an army. He never held political office. He never wrote a book.
Not a single page.
And yet somehow he managed to reshape global civilization more profoundly than, Caesar or Alexander the Great. So how do we even begin to verify the existence of someone who left behind absolutely zero physical artifacts?
It's tough.
Not a house, not a sandal, not a handwritten letter.
Well, what's fascinating here is that the public discourse constantly tangles up two entirely different questions.
Yeah.
And if we want to solve the paradox, we have to separate them right now.
Okay, what are the two questions?
There's the theological question and there's the historical question.
Right.
So the theological question asks, was he divine? Did he perform supernatural miracles? Did he rise from the dead? And history, as an academic discipline, simply does not have the tools to answer that.
Right, because historians work with natural probabilities. Right, not supernatural claims.
Precisely. You can't put a miracle in a test tube. You can't verify it with a radiocarbon date. So the historical question asks something much more grounded. It asks, was there a Jewish man named Jesus living in first-century Roman Judea who preached to crowds, gathered a following, and was ultimately executed by the Roman state?
And because people mash those two questions together, we end up with this massive internet phenomenon that we really have to address before we go any further.
The mythicist trend.
Yes, the trend of internet mythicism. If you, the listener, spend any time on online forums or social media, you have undoubtedly seen the memes claiming that Jesus never existed at all. that he is a total ground-up fabrication.
Yeah, the mythicist position has really exploded in digital spaces over the last couple of decades.
It's everywhere.
It is. The general claim is that Jesus is nothing more than a copycat character. They argue that early Christians basically went shopping through older pagan religions.
Like filling a grocery cart with myths.
Exactly. They took elements from gods like Horus in Egypt or Mithras in Persia or Dionysus in Greece and just cobbled them together to invent a brand new mythical figure for a new cult.
You see the lists everywhere online. They'll say things like, look, Horus was born of a virgin, he was baptized in a river, he had 12 disciples, and he was crucified.
Right, the bullet points.
Yeah, and then they say, therefore the Jesus story is just a stolen Egyptian myth. It sounds like a smoking gun when you read it in a viral post.
It does sound convincing until you actually consult scholars who specialize in ancient religions.
Right.
Because when Egyptologists or classicists look at those internet claims, they universally reject them.
Universally?
Pretty much universally. Because these supposed copycat details are almost always heavily exaggerated, badly mistranslated, or entirely fabricated by modern writers looking to make a point.
Wait, let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around this. Are you saying the Horus claims are just made up?
I am saying that if you read the actual ancient Egyptian texts, Horus wasn't born of a virgin. He was conceived when Isis reconstructed the dismembered body of Osiris.
Oh, wow. That is not a virgin birth.
Not at all.
Yeah?
And Horus didn't have 12 disciples. He had 4 semi-divine followers, called the sons of Horus, and an unspecified number of blacksmiths who followed him into battle.
Blacksmiths.
Yeah, blacksmiths. And he certainly wasn't crucified, because crucifixion was a Roman method of execution invented centuries later.
That makes total sense. Okay, what about Mithras? Because that's another huge one. The internet loves to say Mithras was born of a virgin.
Right, but in the actual Roman Mithraic cults, Mithras was born out of solid rock.
Wait, a rock?
A literal rock. He emerges as a fully grown adult holding a torch and a dagger. The internet takes these vastly different mythological concepts, slaps Christian terminology on them like baptized or virgin birth, and then acts shocked when they sound like Christianity.
Okay, I want to test an analogy on you to see if it explains the mechanism of what's actually happening here.
Go for it.
Claiming that early Christians fabricated Jesus out of thin air just because they used some cultural tropes is kind of like looking at the evolution of open source software. Early Christianity didn't just steal a pagan file and rename it. They took the base code of first century Judaism, and as the movement expanded out into the wider Roman world, it had to run on Greek operating systems.
I see where you're going with this.
Right. So they started using Greek philosophical terms like calling Jesus the Logos, so the local pagan populations could actually understand what they were talking about. It's translation, not fabrication.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that analogy is spot on. Historians absolutely acknowledge that Christianity did not develop in a vacuum.
Right.
It emerged within a vibrant, complex cultural environment. All religions absorb surrounding cultural symbols, language, and philosophical concepts to communicate their ideas. That is just how human culture works.
Yeah.
But cultural influence, using the prevailing language of the time to describe someone, is not the same thing as outright inventing that person.
Exactly. Sharing cultural tropes doesn't mean the underlying person didn't exist. Just because 2 superhero movies both feature capes and sky beams doesn't mean the actor in the second movie is a CGI illusion.
Right. And that is why the consensus among actual scholars is so overwhelming. And I mean scholars across the entire spectrum.
Atheists, Christians, everybody.
Yes. Atheist historians, secular classicists, Jewish scholars, and Christian theologians. They almost universally agree that the historical Jesus existed. In our sources, Dr. Eric Myers, who is an archaeologist and professor emeritus of Jewish studies, points out that denying the basic historical existence of Jesus in academic circles is akin to denying climate change.
Wow. Denying climate change, that is a heavy, heavy comparison.
It's a strong statement.
It shows just how solid the academic consensus is, despite what popular online culture thinks. There's a massive disconnect there. But that brings us right to the methodology, because if I'm the listener, I'm thinking, okay, the experts say he existed, but why do they say that if you admit there is no physical evidence?
Right. It seems contradictory.
Yeah, if we don't have a diary, if we don't have his carpentry tools, what are the historians actually looking at?
This requires us to reset our expectations to the benchmark of antiquity. We have to understand how historians actually verify the ancient world.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, if the standard for proving an ancient person existed was having their physical belongings or a primary handwritten document, we would have to wipe almost everyone out of the history books.
Really? Give me an example. Who else do we lack physical evidence for?
Let's look at Alexander the Great.
Seriously, Alexander the Great.
Yes. He conquered the known world, he built massive cities, and he fundamentally altered the course of human history. Yet, we have zero contemporary accounts of his life.
Wait, none?
None. The most detailed and reliable biographical sources we have for Alexander's campaigns, the works by Arrian and Plutarch, were written roughly 400 years after we died.
400 years. So the closest we get to Alexander the Great is the equivalent of someone today writing a biography of Shakespeare, but without having any of Shakespeare's original texts.
Exactly. Or consider Socrates, one of the foundational pillars of Western philosophy. According to our sources, Socrates never wrote a single word down.
Right.
Everything we know about him comes from his students, primarily Plato and Xenophon, who wrote about him decades later.
And this is where it gets really tricky, because Plato wasn't just a neutral biographer taking dictation.
Not at all. Plato actively used Socrates as a literary character. He used him as a mouthpiece to insert his own philosophical ideas into his dialogues. It is an incredibly difficult academic exercise to untangle the historical Socrates from the literary Socrates that Plato created for his own purposes.
But despite that heavy bias, right, despite the fact that Plato was clearly using Socrates for his own agenda, no serious historian or classicist claims that Socrates was a myth. Nobody thinks Plato just invented him out of thin air.
Because historians expect bias in ancient texts. In fact, if an ancient text isn't biased, a historian will probably be highly suspicious of it.
Why is that?
Every ancient writer had an agenda. The historian's job isn't to throw out a text just because it has a theological or political bias. Their job is to filter the text, to peel back the layers of interpretation and propaganda to find the historical core beneath it.
But I have to push back here because I know what the skeptic listening is going to say.
Let's hear it.
If we are relying on early Christian writings, like the New Testament, isn't that just a classic case of circular reasoning? Isn't that just the Bible proving the Bible? How can you trust writers whose explicit goal is to convince you that this man is a god?
That is a very fair critique, and it's why historians don't treat the Bible as a single magical book that just dropped from the sky.
Right.
When they apply historical methodology, they view the New Testament as a collection of entirely separate, independent, ancient documents. These were texts written by different people in different geographical locations at different times, targeting different audiences.
So they are treating it as an anthology of distinct historical sources that just happen to be bound together centuries later.
Yes. And historians look for two key things when evaluating these sources: independent attestation and chronological proximity.
Okay, define this for us.
Independent attestation means finding multiple sources that confirm the same core event without copying from each other. Chronological proximity means looking at how close the writing is to the actual events.
And how does the timeline look for these early Christian texts?
Compared to other ancient figures, the proximity is striking. The earliest surviving Christian writings are the letters of the Apostle Paul. Our sources place these letters roughly around 50 to 60 AD.
Okay, so
That is only 20 to 30 years after Jesus was executed.
20 to 30 years. In the scope of ancient history, where we are usually dealing with gaps of centuries, like with Alexander, that is practically yesterday. That is dangerously close to living memory.
It is living memory.
Yeah.
Paul is writing while the original eyewitnesses are still alive. And what's crucial is that Paul writes about personally meeting and arguing with Peter, one of Jesus' closest disciples. And he also meets James, whom Paul explicitly identifies as the Lord's brother. Now, whatever you think of Paul's theology, or his blinding light on the road to Damascus, or his visions, historically speaking, he is documenting that he interacted with the biological sibling and the best friend of a man who was executed just a couple of decades prior.
That anchors the figure of Jesus firmly in a specific, recent historical reality, not in the misty, timeless realms of ancient mythology. I mean, you don't have arguments with the biological brother of a mythical sun god.
Exactly. You just don't. But historians don't stop there. To fully satisfy the rigors of the discipline, we have to step completely outside the Christian bubble.
We have to look at the critics.
Yes.
Okay.
We have to look at entirely secular external sources. What do the administrative ledgers of the Roman Empire tell us about this period?
And this is where we have to talk about Publius Cornelius Tacitus. If we are looking for secular proof, Tacitus is the gold standard. He is generally considered the greatest of all Roman historians.
He was a Roman senator, a consul, and a deeply pragmatic historian. In the year 115 AD, Tacitus wrote his final major work, the Annals, which documented the history of the Roman Empire, from the reign of Tiberius to Nero.
Okay.
And in Book 15, he describes the catastrophic Great Fire of Rome that happened in 64 AD.
Oh, this is the fire where the rumor started that Emperor Nero played the fiddle while Rome burned.
Right. The rumors were that Nero started the fire himself to clear land for his new golden palace. So to deflect the blame, Nero needed a scapegoat.
Naturally.
So he blamed this new, deeply unpopular sect operating in the slums of Rome called Christians. And in explaining to his elite Roman readers who these strange people are, Tacitus writes a very specific passing historical detail.
What does he say?
He says that the founder of this name, Christus, was put to death by the procurator Pontius Pilate during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius.
Let's pause on that because that is massive. You have the preeminent Roman historian explicitly confirming the exact time period, the exact location, and the exact Roman official responsible for the execution.
And we have to consider Tacitus's attitude toward them. He was no friend to the Christians.
Not at all.
He calls their movement a mischievous superstition and a deadly evil that had broken out in Judea and spread all the way to Rome. He describes their tortures by Nero with a sort of grim, aristocratic detachment.
He didn't care about them.
He has absolutely no theological skin in the game. He doesn't care about their beliefs. He only cares about their disruption of Roman order.
So he's not writing propaganda for them. He actively despises them. And as a senator and a member of the elite committee that oversaw foreign religious cults, Tacitus had access to official Roman records and reports. He wasn't just repeating street gossip.
Furthermore, Tacitus isn't an isolated voice. We also have Suetonius, the Roman historian and biographer, writing around 121 AD. He mentions that Emperor Claudius expelled Jews from Rome because of constant riots and disturbances instigated by Christus.
Another administrative headache.
Exactly. Then we have Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor in modern-day Turkey, writing an official letter to the Emperor Trajan in 112 AD.
Pliny's letter is fascinating because it reads like a frustrated bureaucratic memo. He's essentially asking HR for legal advice on how to execute Christians.
He is. He writes to the emperor saying, "I don't know what to do with these people. They gather before dawn, they sing hymns to Christ as to a god, and they refuse to worship your image."
Wow.
He even mentions torturing 2 enslaved women who were called deaconesses to try and extract the truth about the cult.
So these secular Roman sources prove that within a few decades of his death, the movement sparked by Jesus was causing massive administrative headaches across the empire, from Judea all the way to the capital in Rome.
Widespread disruption.
And the Romans tracked the origin of that headache back to a specific man executed by their own prefect, Pilate.
Which brings us back to the Pilate stone you mentioned at the very beginning.
Yes. Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's dive deeper into that, because it perfectly illustrates the archaeological verification methods historians rely on. For centuries, critics argued that Pontius Pilate might be a fictional character invented by the gospel writers.
To shift the blame for Jesus' death onto the Roman state.
Exactly. Because despite Pilate supposedly ruling Judea for 10 years, there was no physical trace of him.
No statues, no monuments, no official decrees, just the texts.
Until 1961, archaeologists were excavating the ruins of Caesarea Maritima. This was a spectacular, gleaming coastal city built by King Herod the Great. It was the administrative capital of the Roman province of Judea.
Major hub.
Yeah. So they were excavating a massive ancient theater, and they found a damaged block of limestone that had been repurposed by later builders. They had literally flipped it over to use it as a step in a staircase.
Oh.
But carved into the face of that stone was a Latin inscription dedicating a temple to the Emperor Tiberius. The dedication was signed by Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea.
It was an electrifying discovery, and it illustrates a profound point about historical methodology. If it took until 1961 to find a single piece of carved stone proving the existence of an incredibly powerful Roman governor, a man who commanded legions and levied taxes, it puts the lack of physical evidence for a poor, itinerant Jewish peasant into sharp, realistic perspective.
Right.
We shouldn't expect to find a Jesus stone. The fact that we found the Pilate stone perfectly validates the specific, localized political framework that the ancient texts describe.
It proves the stage was set exactly the way the documents claim it was. And if you think about it logically, the Romans had zero incentive to invent a leader for a troublesome cult.
None.
If the Roman state could have proved Jesus was a myth, they would have plastered that information everywhere to shut the Christians up and stop the riots. But they didn't. They just executed his followers and recorded the administrative nuisance.
They didn't care about the theology. They cared about the treason. But, if the Romans only cared about Jesus as an administrative problem, that leaves a massive blind spot in our investigation.
How so?
Well, the Romans didn't understand Jewish theology. They just understood political disruption. To actually understand why he was executed, we have to look at the people who understood his theology, the local Jewish authorities.
Right. If we move away from the Roman senators in their marble villas, what did the non-Christian Jewish community, the people living next door, the religious authorities he clashed with, say about him?
This raises an important question, and it brings us to what historians call hostile witnesses. And the most important figure in this category is Flavius Josephus.
Josephus is a character straight out of a political thriller. Our sources detail how he was born in Jerusalem around 37 AD, so just a few years after the crucifixion. He was a prominent, highly educated Jewish priest. And when the Great Jewish Revolt against Rome broke out in 66 AD, Josephus actually fought as a military commander against the Roman legions in Galilee.
He did. But when his forces were defeated, he surrendered, and he managed to accurately prophesy that the Roman general Vespasian would become emperor.
That's a good way to save your life.
It worked. He ended up defecting to the Romans. He became a historian under the patronage of the Flavian emperors, witnessing the total destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in the year 70 AD from the Roman camp.
Talk about a complicated legacy. So, toward the end of the first century, he writes this massive multi-volume work called Antiquities of the Jews, mostly to explain Jewish history to a Roman audience.
Right.
And in this massive work, he mentions Jesus twice.
The first mention is arguably the most fiercely debated paragraph in ancient history. It's known as the Testimonium Flavianum.
Okay, break that down.
In the standard Greek manuscripts that have been passed down to us, Josephus writes about Jesus and calls him a wise man. He says he did surprising feats, and then the text explicitly says he was the Christ and that he rose from the dead on the third day.
Okay, stop right there. The alarm bells are ringing. Josephus was an Orthodox, devout Jew. He never converted to Christianity. He lived and died a Jew, serving Roman emperors. There is absolutely no way he wrote the words, "He was the Christ," or affirmed the resurrection.
You are absolutely right. And this is where textual critics have to operate like forensic linguists. When scholars look at that paragraph, they immediately spot the forgery.
How?
Josephus has a very specific, consistent vocabulary across his massive volumes. Suddenly, in this one paragraph, he is using glowing Christian phrasing that appears nowhere else in his writings.
It's like reading a serious 19th century Charles Dickens novel and suddenly a character says, "That's cat, bro." The vocabulary simply doesn't fit the author.
Exactly. So the immediate assumption by some early skeptics was that Christian scribes copying the text centuries later completely invented the entire paragraph and inserted it into Josephus's work out of thin air.
But the scholarly consensus today doesn't support that total fabrication theory, do they?
No, they don't. The consensus is that Josephus did write about Jesus, but later Christian scribes couldn't resist tampering with the text. They likely saw a relatively neutral or dismissive mention of Jesus and decided to add some theological flavor to make Josephus sound like a believer.
But wait, how do we know what the original text actually said before the scribes got their hands on it?
Because of a remarkable discovery of a 10th century Arabic version of Josephus's text.
Wait, an Arabic version?
Yeah, 10th century one, preserved by a Christian bishop named Maccabeus.
I love this detail. The Arabic manuscript is like an uncorrupted backup file.
It essentially is. This version seems to reflect the original text before the Greek Christian scribes overly embellished it. In this Arabic text, the glowing theological declarations are completely gone.
What does it say instead?
It simply says, there was a wise man whose conduct was good, he gained disciples, Pilate condemned him to be crucified, and his disciples reported that he appeared to them alive after his death.
So it objectively reports what the Christians believed, without Josephus endorsing it himself. That perfectly aligns with a neutral outside historian recording the genesis of a new sect.
And we know Josephus wasn't entirely tampered with because his second mention of Jesus in Book 20 is universally accepted by scholars as completely authentic.
What's the second mention?
In passing, while discussing the illegal execution of a man named James by a hot-headed high priest, Josephus identifies James to his readers as the brother of Jesus who was called Christ.
Just a casual reference. He uses Jesus to clarify which James he's talking about, since James and Jesus were incredibly common names in first century Judea.
Precisely. It assumes the reader already knows who Jesus is from the earlier, now tampered with mention.
But Josephus isn't the only Jewish source we have. The deep dive sources also bring in later rabbinic and Talmudic literature, as well as medieval texts like the Toledot Yeshu.
Right.
And if Josephus was neutral, these sources are openly hostile. They are brutal. They sought to entirely belittle and discredit Jesus. They call him a magician who led the people astray. They claim he went to Egypt to learn witchcraft and carved magic formulas into his flesh.
Very intense polemics.
Yeah, and they even attack the circumstances of his birth, claiming he was illegitimate, the son of a Roman soldier named Pantera and a hairdresser named Miriam.
They pulled no punches. They were engaged in a fierce theological battle with the growing Christian movement.
But this raises a really obvious question. If these texts are actively insulting him, calling him a sorcerer and a bastard, how in the world does that prove he existed?
This is the core logic of the hostile witness. Think about it strategically. These writers despised the early Christian movement. It was a massive theological threat to them.
Right.
If Jesus were a complete fabrication, a fictional copycat of Horace invented by the Apostle Paul, or some Greek philosophers.
Yeah.
The easiest, most devastating way for the ancient rabbis to destroy Christianity would be to simply expose the forgery. They would have said, "You are worshiping a phantom. This man never lived in our towns. He never walked in our temple."
They would have pointed out that the emperor had no clothes.
Yes, but they never do that. Even the fiercest critics of early Christianity and antiquity never argued that Jesus was a myth. Instead, they argued over who he was and how he did the things he did.
They didn't deny the actions, just the source of the power.
Right. They didn't deny he performed unexplainable acts. They attributed those acts to dark Egyptian magic rather than divine power. They didn't deny his birth. They framed it as shameful and illegitimate to counter the virgin birth narrative. The fact that his worst enemies accepted his existence as a baseline reality is incredibly strong historical evidence that the man walked the earth. You don't write elaborate smear campaigns about a ghost.
If your worst enemies agree on your basic biography just so they have something to insult, you probably existed.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've established the external secular Roman evidence and the hostile Jewish evidence. Now we have to turn inward. We have to look at the internal Christian evidence. Specifically, how do scholars evaluate the reliability of the Gospels themselves? Because one of the biggest arguments you hear today, especially in pop history documentaries, is about who actually wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
The question of authorship is central to evaluating any ancient text. And there is a very popular modern theory that claims the four Gospels originally circulated completely anonymously for roughly 100 years.
100 years with no names.
Right. The theory argues that they had no titles, no author names attached, and it was only in the late 2nd century that early church leaders falsely slapped the names of apostles onto these texts to give them fake authority to win theological arguments.
It paints a picture of a smoky back room where church bishops are saying, we need people to believe this scroll, let's just write Matthew at the top of it. But our sources, specifically the deep dives from Catholic productions and textual critics, deeply challenge this theory. And they challenge it not with theology, but with hard manuscript data.
Manuscript data is unforgiving. If you want to know if the texts were originally anonymous, you go to the archives. We have thousands of ancient Greek manuscripts and fragments of the New Testament. And out of all of them, do you know how many anonymous copies of the four Gospels exist?
0. Not a single one.
Exactly 0. Every single ancient Greek manuscript of these texts that has a surviving title attributes them unanimously to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
And to put into perspective how miraculous that unanimity is, the sources contrast the Gospels with another book in the New Testament, the Epistle to the Hebrews.
This is a fantastic comparison to illustrate how textual transmission actually worked. The book of Hebrews actually was written anonymously.
Right.
The author never identifies themselves in the text, and because it lacked an author's name, what happened when it was copied and circulated across the ancient world?
Total chaos in the manuscripts. Scribes in different regions tried to guess who wrote it. Some manuscripts attributed it to Paul, others to Luke, others to a man named Titus or Barnabas. We see the exact messy regional variations you would expect when a truly anonymous document circulates in antiquity. Scribes try to fill in the blanks.
Precisely. If the four Gospels had circulated as blank, anonymous texts for an entire century, A scribe in Egypt and a scribe in Rome wouldn't have magically guessed the exact same names to slap on them.
No way.
You would have a Gospel of Peter in one region and a Gospel of Andrew in another for the exact same text. But we don't see that. The manuscript tradition is completely unified, which strongly suggests the titles were attached to the text from the very beginning of their distribution.
And beyond just the manuscript data, there's a fascinating logical argument about the specific names they supposedly chose. Let's play this out. If I am a sneaky second-century scribe, and my goal is to forge absolute, unquestionable authority for my text so I can win a theological debate, why on earth would I attribute my forgeries to Mark and Luke?
It makes no sense. Mark and Luke were, in the grand scheme of the early church, nobodies. They were not among the original 12 apostles. They were not eyewitnesses to Jesus' ministry. They were later administrative companions of Peter and Paul.
Right.
If you were going to invent an author to give a fake gospel supreme authority, you go straight to the top. You named it the Gospel of Peter, or the Gospel of Mary, or the Gospel of Jesus himself.
Right, you don't pick the administrative assistants. And even the choice of Matthew is logically baffling for a forgery. Matthew was an apostle, yes, but he was a tax collector. We have to understand what that meant in first century Judea. A tax collector working for the occupying Roman Empire was the equivalent of a corrupt IRS agent mixed with a traitor who was funding the enemy army.
They were despised.
No one liked or trusted tax collectors. If you're trying to build credibility for a holy book, you don't attribute it to the guy everyone in town despised.
The only logical reason the early church universally attributed these texts to Mark, Luke, and Matthew is because they actually believed those specific unlikely men wrote them or compiled the sources for them. They were stuck with the historical tradition, even if it wasn't the most glamorous PR move.
Oh wait, let me play devil's advocate here, because there's another common internet argument. The illiterate fisherman argument. How could a bunch of poor, illiterate peasants from Galilee write complex Greek literature?
This is where understanding the historical context is crucial. First, as you just pointed out, not all of the disciples were fishermen. Matthew was a tax collector. That profession strictly required literacy.
You had to keep the books.
You had to read, write, and keep complex ledgers in multiple languages to do that job. Furthermore, the ancient world functioned heavily on dictation.
They used secretaries.
Yes, amanuenses, professional scribes. Even the Apostle Paul, who was highly educated, routinely used secretaries to physically write down his letters while he dictated them. He even adds personal greetings at the end in his own handwriting to authenticate them. It was the standard practice of the era.
So it wasn't unusual at all.
Not at all. The idea that these oral traditions couldn't have been recorded because Peter was a fisherman ignores how ancient literary production actually worked.
We also have external corroboration for this. Early church writers, like Irenaeus in the 2nd century, Irenaeus is a critical link because he was a disciple of Polycarp, and Polycarp was a direct disciple of the Apostle John. So Irenaeus is only 1 degree of separation away from the original inner circle.
A very tight chain of custody.
Yeah. And Irenaeus explicitly writes that Mark, acting as Peter's interpreter, handed down in writing the things that were preached by Peter. He confirms the manuscript titles with his own historical chain of custody.
And we can go even deeper into the texts themselves to prove their early localized origins. Bart Ehrman's blog highlights something extraordinary about the linguistic footprint of the Gospels. The Gospels we have are written in Greek, which was the universal language of the Roman Empire, but they contain unmistakable traces of Aramaic.
Aramaic being the native language of first-century Roman Palestine, the language Jesus and his disciples actually spoke.
Exactly. And textual critics use this like a linguistic X-ray. Ehrman points out that in several critical moments, the Greek text suddenly preserves the original Aramaic punchline. For example, in the story where Jesus raises a young girl from the dead, the Gospel of Mark quotes him saying, "Talitha kumi," and then the author has to translate it for the Greek reader, which means, "little girl, arise."
Ehrman uses a great analogy for this. He compares it to a bilingual friend telling a joke. Even if they tell the setup of the story in English, they will often deliver the final punchline in their native language, say Spanish or German, because the cadence and the cultural weight of the punchline just hits better in the original language.
It's a perfect analogy.
The fact that the Greek Gospels leave these Aramaic phrases intact shows that these stories originally circulated orally in the Aramaic-speaking villages of Judea, long before they were ever translated into Greek for the wider Roman world.
It proves the traditions weren't invented decades later by Greek philosophers in Athens or Alexandria, and it goes further than just preserved phrases. There are stories in the Greek text that actually resolve logical contradictions when you translate them back into Aramaic.
Oh, this is the Son of Man detail. This blew my mind. Tell the listeners about this.
It's a brilliant piece of linguistic detective work. In Greek, Jesus constantly refers to himself with the specific exalted title, the Son of Man. But in Aramaic, the phrase is baranash, which is just an idiom that simply means a human being or man.
Right.
So in one story in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is arguing with the religious leaders about the strict laws of resting on the Sabbath. In the Greek, the logic of his argument gets a bit tangled. He seems to be saying, I am the divine Son of Man, therefore I can do what I want on the Sabbath.
But when you look at the underlying Aramaic, he isn't making a grandiose claim about his divinity. He is making a profound egalitarian point about human welfare.
Yes. If you translate it back to baranash, the argument flows perfectly. The Sabbath was made for bar the humanity, not humanity for the Sabbath. Therefore, baranash humanity is Lord of the Sabbath.
The Greek translator capitalized it to make a theological point about Jesus, but the original Aramaic reveals a grounded Jewish rabbi teaching about the purpose of the law, that human need supersedes strict ritual. You cannot fake that linguistic depth decades later in a Greek-speaking city hundreds of miles away. It anchors the core of the texts firmly in the soil of first-century Palestine.
It does, and understanding that specific soil is incredibly important. We've established the methodology, the independent attestation, the hostile witnesses, the archaeological framework, the Aramaic linguistic roots. But what composite picture actually emerges from all of this data? Who is the man behind the texts?
Right. So, who was he historically? Let's look at the context of his life. The sources say Jesus was a Galilean Jew, born roughly around 4 BCE. And for a long time, the popular, almost Sunday school image of him was this solitary, gentle peasant wandering around a bucolic, isolated backwater, completely removed from the politics and economics of the wider world.
The humble carpenter living in the middle of nowhere, talking to birds and sheep. But archaeology has radically shattered that image.
The PBO, or Frontline Symposium, discusses the archaeological revelations at Sepphoris. This totally changed how I view the historical Jesus. Nazareth, the village where Jesus grew up, wasn't an isolated bubble. It was a tiny mud brick village, sure, but it was located less than 4 miles away from Sepphoris. And Sepphoris was a booming, highly sophisticated Hellenistic metropolis. It was the capital of the Galilee.
Herod Antipas, the Roman-appointed ruler, was rebuilding Sepphoris massively during the exact time Jesus was growing up and working. It was a massive urban renewal project. Archaeologists have found magnificent Roman villas there, complete with a stunning mosaic floor they dubbed the Mona Lisa of the Galilee. It had a 4,000-seat theater, sprawling markets, and complex aqueducts.
And here's where it connects to Jesus. In the Greek text, Jesus' profession is identified as a tekton. We usually translate that as carpenter, but in the ancient world, it really meant an artisan, a general contractor, or a stone builder. If you were a builder living 4 miles from the largest Roman construction boom in the region, where do you think you went to work every day?
You didn't stay in Nazareth whittling wooden chairs. You commuted to Sepphoris.
Exactly. You walked the hour to the city to work on the aqueducts and the villas. And to work in the markets and construction sites of Sepphoris, you couldn't just speak rustic Aramaic. You had to negotiate contracts, buy supplies, and deal with Roman overseers. Scholars now believe Jesus was likely bilingual or even trilingual. He was fluent in Aramaic, capable of reading Hebrew scripture in the synagogue, and conversational in Hellenistic Greek.
This changes everything about how we view him. It means the historical Jesus was not a naive rustic. He was intimately proximate to a thriving, sophisticated urban environment. That brought with it an exposure to all the diversity, the crushing Roman taxation, and the stark class divides of the empire. He saw the haves in their mosaic-lined villas and the have-nots in the mud-brick villages.
And he also saw the intense, radical religious fervency of his time. The Galilee region was notoriously rebellious. One scholar in the documentary even compared it to the 1960s Berkeley of Palestine. It was a hotbed of political and religious radicalism. People were angry at Rome, and they were angry at the elite Jewish temple authorities who collaborated with Rome. And the specific religious context Jesus operated in was what scholars call apocalyptic eschatology.
This is a crucial concept to grasp. First-century Judaism was not a monolith. It was highly diverse and heavily fractured. You had the elite Sadducees running the temple in Jerusalem, keeping the peace with Rome. You had the strict Pharisees focusing on the rigorous application of the law in daily life. And then you had radical separatist groups like the Essenes, the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls.
The Essenes are fascinating. They had literally moved out into the harsh desert near Qumran because they believed the current world order, including the temple in Jerusalem, was entirely corrupt. They believed God was about to initiate a cataclysmic cosmic war, the sons of light against the sons of darkness.
They were waiting for the imminent end of the world. And Jesus enters the historical record right in the middle of this fever pitch, submitting to baptism by a man named John the Baptist. John was a classic apocalyptic prophet. He was out in the wilderness, wearing camel's hair, screaming, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is near." He didn't mean a spiritual feeling in your heart. He meant that God was about to dramatically intervene in human history to overthrow the corrupt powers, meaning Rome and the corrupt elites, and establish divine justice on earth.
And Jesus took up that exact mantle. His core preaching revolved around the kingdom of God. And we have to understand how dangerous that phrase was. In the first century, religion and politics were inextricably intertwined. You couldn't separate them. Rome claimed that Caesar was the son of God, and that the Roman Empire was the ultimate kingdom bringing peace to the world. The Pax Romana.
So when a peasant rabbi walks around the Galilee, telling massive crowds of poor, heavily taxed people the kingdom of God is arriving, he isn't just giving them a comforting sermon about the afterlife. He is making a direct, politically treasonous statement. He is saying, Caesar's kingdom is illegitimate, and God's kingdom is about to replace it.
It was a deeply subversive message, and it inevitably brought him into the crosshairs of the two powers that maintained the status quo. The elite temple authorities in Jerusalem who needed to keep the peace to maintain their power, and the Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate, whose sole job was to prevent rebellions and collect taxes.
Which brings us to the end of his life. And one of the most powerful tools historians use to verify that the core events of the Gospels actually happened is called the criterion of embarrassment.
So what does this all mean? I think this is perhaps the most compelling piece of historical logic in our entire deep dive, because it asks us to look at human psychology.
The idea is this. If early Christians were simply inventing a mythology to win converts and impress the Greco-Roman world, they would have invented a triumphant, glorious hero. The prevailing Jewish expectation for the Messiah was a conquering king, a new David who would violently slaughter the Romans, cleanse the temple, and sit on a throne in Jerusalem.
But instead, the foundational text of Christianity revolves around its leader being arrested without a fight, betrayed by his closest friends, and executed as a state criminal via crucifixion.
And we have to really understand what crucifixion meant in antiquity. It wasn't just lethal. It was designed by the Romans to be the ultimate psychological terror. The Roman orator Cicero called it the most cruel and disgusting penalty. It was specifically meant to completely degrade the sufferer.
It denied them a noble death, which was a massive preoccupation in the pagan world. A Roman citizen could be beheaded. That was honorable and quick. But crucifixion was reserved for slaves, pirates, and rebels. The victim was stripped naked, tortured, and left to suffocate publicly over days, often at a crossroads, as a grotesque billboard warning to anyone else who might challenge Roman authority.
So what does this all mean for historians? It means the crucifixion is a historical bedrock. The early Christians would never, ever have invented it. It was too shameful. The Apostle Paul himself admits in his letters that preaching a crucified Messiah is a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. It was a PR nightmare. How do you convince a Roman that a guy who got squashed like a bug by their local governor is actually the Lord of the universe?
You don't. If you were making up a superhero origin story, you don't write that all of his loyal sidekicks abandoned him and fled in absolute terror the moment the temple police showed up. You don't write that Peter, his right-hand man, cowardly denied even knowing him to a servant girl. You don't write that the leader's final words on the cross were a despairing, agonizing cry, quoting Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?"
Mere inventors would have concealed every single one of those details. If they were fabricating a myth, they would have written that Jesus fought back with lightning, or that he stoically laughed at the Romans like a Greek philosopher, and that his disciples bravely died by his side. The inclusion of the humiliating death, the disciples' cowardice, and the agonizing doubt on the cross is a prime historical indicator that these core events actually happened.
The early church didn't invent the crucifixion. They were stuck with the historical reality of it. The history was a stubborn, uncomfortable fact they had to build their faith around, not a myth they conjured out of thin air.
That perfectly summarizes the historian's view. When you take this entire mosaic of evidence we've discussed, the incredibly early proximity of Paul's letters to the actual events, the independent gospel traditions anchored in native Aramaic linguistic footprints, the hostile records of the Jewish rabbis, the administrative ledgers of Roman historians like Tacitus, and the hard limestone of the Pilate stone, the historical reality of Jesus of Nazareth is secured.
It isn't secured by faith. It is secured by the exact same rigorous, painstaking historical methods we use to verify the existence of anyone in the ancient world. The academic consensus isn't some grand theological conspiracy, it's just good history.
History cannot prove the virgin birth. It cannot prove the miracles. It cannot prove the resurrection. Those remain matters of personal belief, faith, and theology. But it overwhelmingly proves that the man walked the earth. He lived, he preached, he challenged the power structures of his day, and he was crushed by the brutal machinery of the Roman Empire.
And yet, here we are. It is the ultimate historical irony. Rome crucified thousands upon thousands of dissidents, slaves, and rebels, and almost all of them disappeared into the dust of oblivion. But somehow this one Galilean artisan, executed as a disposable administrative nuisance, ended up outlasting the empire that killed him.
Humans constantly reshape historical figures into mirrors of themselves. Over the centuries, Jesus has been endlessly reimagined. He's been cast as a pacifist, a radical revolutionary, a socialist, a capitalist, a conquering king, and a mystical philosopher. Every era projects its own anxieties and hopes onto him.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to ponder long after this deep dive ends. If the historical Jesus of Nazareth was so deeply embedded in the specific, localized political struggles of first-century Judea, a man who preached the imminent apocalyptic end of the corrupt world order and was executed by the state for it, how would he react today? What would that trilingual Galilean builder think if he could see his localized anti-imperial message transformed into the vast, institutionalized global empires of the modern era that now rule in his name?
It is a profound paradox. The rebel executed by the empire became the ultimate symbol of empires.
It is a question that bridges history, faith, and human nature. We've thrown a lot of history at you today, but we hope it gives you a new lens to view antiquity. Keep questioning the layers, keep looking for the history beneath the myths, and keep exploring.